All right. Once again, Missouri is bicameral. Missouri has its own Congress that we don't call Congress because everything has to be complicated. We call it the General Assembly. It has its own House, has its own Senate. Over the last couple weeks, we've gotten to hear from two people that serve in the Missouri House of Representatives. This is the second person. We split up Springfield into 6 districts. How many districts would you say?
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, that's about right. So 6 districts or so. Betsy Fogel represented a little bit more east than OTC. A little south of OTC is the 134th district. Round of applause for our guest speaker real quick. Alex, sir, your floor.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. And first of all, I have to say I'm really impressed by the attendance on a Friday icy morning. And also really impressed that nearly everyone got here before I did, and I was 5 minutes early, so I thought that was pretty good. In my law school classes, no one would show up until about a minute before class started. So to have this big of a attendance on a Friday and everyone here early was impressive. I'm Alex Riley, state representative from the 134th district. I'm glad you got to hear from Betsy last week. It's kind of interesting, but Betsy's one of my best friends, both inside and outside the legislature. It's probably, a lot of people think, kind of an unlikely friendship since we're fairly polar opposites as far as policy goes. But I think that's one of the neat things about the Missouri legislature and our state level politicians is while we have a lot of fierce disagreements on policy, a lot of us are truly friends outside of those debates. And I think that's really something that should get more attention but doesn't. It's not nearly as sexy to talk about everyone being friends as it is everyone throwing grenades at each other. I always like to talk about that whenever I have a chance to present is things are not nearly as bad as the headlines make it sound, especially when you're talking about political discourse at the state level. One thing I would note is I've basically lost my voice this week and it's just now starting to come back. So to the extent I sound a bit like a frog, I apologize. I learned this week that it's kind of hard to be a politician when you have no voice. There were a couple of times in committee this week where we were voting on something and I couldn't get out any sort of sound at all. So I was trying to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to indicate my yes or no votes, and that was kind of an awkward but entertaining situation. So with all that being said, I should probably stop rambling and get into what we're here to talk about. So I represent this part of Springfield, which right now is mostly south and central Springfield. It's one of the smallest districts in geographic area in the state. There are some districts in the state that are larger than states. I have a colleague who represents 5 or 6 counties, and his district is larger than the state of Rhode Island. And then you have my district, which you can literally drive across in 5 minutes. It takes him 2 or 3 hours to get all the way across his district. So it's really interesting how the districts in Missouri are designed, but it's based on population. So every district has roughly 37,000, 38,000 people. We just went through a redistricting phase, so my district in the future is going to look quite a bit different. Basically, I lose all of my territory north of Battlefield Road, and I just have South Springfield and the city of Battlefield, and then just a little bit of a neighborhood north of Battlefield Road, which your teacher lives in, and he'll become my constituent, so I'm excited about that. I think I'm probably going to mostly just answer your questions because what I have to say is probably less interesting to you than what you want to know. So I think at this point, I'll open it up for questions and we'll go from there.
Let's start with some basics. First of all, how'd you get into the position that you're in right now?
So I was elected in November of 2020 after a pretty competitive primary. The result ultimately wasn't that competitive. I won with a little over 70% of the vote, but I was running against a state senator's son, so that certainly added an interesting dynamic to things. And then in the general election was competitive as well. I won with a little over 56% of the vote. And that November race which it's interesting because my district, in some parts of the state, the top of the ticket, President Trump helped those candidates do better. My district, Trump was not the most popular individual, so I had to significantly outperform him in order to win. And it was kind of interesting to look at how the statewide candidates did in this district. So it's a little more competitive than most areas around the state are. So been involved in politics since I was about 12 years old. There was a US Senate race in 2002 that I got really interested in as a 12-year-old, which is kind of odd because my parents weren't political activists by any stretch. They voted and that was about it. But there was that race was the first race after the September 11th terrorist attacks, and that really caught my attention as a youngster growing up. And I decided to get involved in politics, and I asked my parents, hey, can I go knock doors for this candidate who was running? And for some reason they said yes, and let me run around the city knocking doors for Jim Town was his name, and he ultimately won in a very tight race in 2002. And then at that point I was pretty well hooked and worked on somebody's campaign, at least one campaign, pretty much every election cycle after that. Wasn't really planning on running for office at the time that I did. From a personal perspective, it probably couldn't have been worse timing, to be honest. My wife and I were expecting our first kid, and it's pretty tough to run a campaign in those types of circumstances. And then I had also just recently switched law firms where I was getting my new law practice up and going. But there's some things going around the country that really caused me a lot of concern. And I felt that I couldn't just sit on the sidelines whilst there were these terrible things happening. One of those things that really brought me into the race the most was a focus on economic issues. So all of you guys living in Springfield know kind of the economic dynamic here, where we have a lot of opportunity, but we also have an extremely high poverty rate, somewhere around 25%. And for me, that's just not acceptable that we can live in a city like this, but have those high poverty rates. And I was frustrated by the lack of really meaningful attention that was being given to that issue, and frustrated that most of the solutions that were being proposed, to me, didn't actually get to the root of the problem. They weren't really focused on trying to come alongside folks in those situations and help bring them out of those situations. Most of the focus seems to be on trying to help them manage through that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think as policymakers we should be more focused on trying to help folks get out of those types of tough situations. So throughout my time in the House, which has only been a year and a half now, it feels like I've been there forever already, most of my focus has been on economic issues. So out of the 10 bills I filed this year, 8 of them are directly related to economic things. I'm also on the Budget Committee, where I have an opportunity to do a lot of things in the budget to try and address some of those economic things. So last year, I was really excited to have the opportunity to put over $1 million in the budget for a couple of really cool nonprofits here in Springfield that have a proven track record of coming alongside people and bringing them out of those tough situations. So you may have heard of one or maybe both of them. The Drew Lewis Foundation, I was able to work with them and put almost $700,000 in the budget for them. There's another one in Springfield that's not quite as focused on poverty specifically, but it is related to that, called the Geek Foundation. And what they're focused on mostly is improving the number of minority individuals in the tech sector. So that I was able to work with them to put some state funding towards their operations and help them focus on not just minorities, but also minorities in those low income situations. And what they do is have these folks go through these series of classes, and then upon completion of those classes, they're able to go right into these high-paying tech jobs. So instead of having to go into a 4-year degree and incur thousands and thousands of dollars worth of debt, they go through these relatively short courses, and upon graduation, they're making $60,000 a year. So you can have a very rapid turnaround in someone's life in just a few short months. So those are a few of the things that I've been really focused on in my time in the House so far.
What would you say your day-to-day is like when you're at the Capitol? I know you're actually only at the Capitol 6 months out of the year?
Yeah,
so what would you say your day-to-day?
So our legislative session runs from the first week of January through about the middle of May. And most session weeks are Monday through Thursday. So we're home most Fridays, which is why I'm standing in front of you today. Days really vary, but for me, I'm usually one of the first to get there. I tend to get there around 7 or so in the morning. I'm on a lot of committees, which is really exciting because it means I have the opportunity to be involved in a lot of the bills that get passed. But it also certainly adds a lot higher workload when you compare sort of my committee load to a lot of the other representatives. So in order to make sure that I'm able to be as prepared as I need to be, I usually get there early, and then I'm in committee pretty much all day. So I'll be in 2, 3, 4 committees a day. Right now, we're working through the state budget, and those are extremely long days. So typically, anytime we're not on the House floor debating and arguing bills, we'll be in budget committee, and then I may have a couple other committees going on at the same time that I have to bounce around to in order to vote in committee and ask questions on bills and things of that nature. And then whenever I'm not in committee, there's usually meetings, folks from back home that are wanting to visit about issues they're concerned about, or various groups, advocacy groups that are concerned as well. So that's kind of what the average day looks like, and then after you're finished with committees, most of the time various groups of legislators will go out in the evenings for dinner, and that's where a lot of the policy making actually happens, because a lot of politics is based on relationships. So you're not going to be able to be an effective legislator if you're just throwing bombs on Twitter all the time. Effective legislators are the ones who are willing to sit down with anyone, develop personal connections, personal relationships with those people, and that's how you're able to move your policy agenda forward. So a lot of that happens outside the Capitol in the evenings, where you're just able to visit with someone and really get to know them on a personal level.
So at the very beginning, you said you and actually Representative Fogel have a surprising relationship. She's a Democrat.
That's right.
You are a Republican.
Yep.
Why is that your team? Why have you signed up for that particular political party?
So that's probably a very long answer. I'll give you as short of one as I can. Certainly, a lot of it has to do with how I was raised. So, grew up in a family where faith was certainly at the core of everything we did. Grew up homeschooled from kindergarten all the way through high school. So my parents were certainly conservative and instilled those values in me and my siblings. And then as I was venturing out on my own and testing those views that I grew up with other sort of views, I'm someone who bases my opinions on more facts and data. So when people are coming to me with ideas and proposals, I usually ask, can you present me with facts and data that back up what you're trying to get me to do? And a lot of the things that we debate, when you start looking at what data supports various ideologies, I think a lot of the data supports the things that I tend to support. So things like limited government. I think that we have a lot of history over the years that show that people that live in societies that have less government, that are more free, tend to be more prosperous and more successful. So that certainly plays a large part in the way I see the world. And I'll probably stop there, but we can dig into that some more with some follow-up questions if you'd like to.